Good afternoon from Queen's School of Business, and thank you for joining us for today's QSB Insight webinar on the topic of building resilience. My name is Neil Bierce, and I understand that everyone is here to hear from Mr. Dane Jensen, so I'll get the introduction and the early housekeeping slides done as quickly as possible. Today's session will be recorded. I've already had a number of people ask about that, and we do record every one of our monthly webinars. They are all archived on our website at qsbinsight.com, and additionally, we'll send out a copy of this recording to everyone who registered. So if you do have any colleagues who have registered and are unable to join us, you can let them know that they'll be receiving a copy of this recording probably early next week. Secondly, we encourage any and all questions, and please feel free to ask those at any time. You can direct them my way, and I will be serving as the moderator for the Q&A session following today's slides. So please ask them at any time. It makes it a lot easier if you don't wait until the very last second to send them in. So please send them exactly as they hit your mind. I'll get them triaged and through to Dane, and we'll have a great Q&A session at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dane Jensen. He's the CEO of Performance Coaching Incorporated, who are very good friends of ours here at the Business School. Dave's joining us today from Toronto. He's a self-described furious cross-pollinator between the podium and the boardroom. As CEO of Performance Coaching, he works every day to enhance Canada's business and athletic competitiveness through better strategy and stronger leadership. His clients include CIBC, WestJet, University Health Network, the Canadian Paralympic Committee, the Canadian Sport Institute, and Right to Play. He has worked as an advisor to senior executives in 12 countries on 5 continents. He contributes regularly to the Globe and Mail on the topics of strategy and leadership. He was previously an associate partner at the strategy consultancy Monitor Deloitte, and as well, he, in addition to his colleagues at Performance Coaching, are very beloved session leaders here at Queen's School of Business. So we're going to have a fabulous session. We're going to learn a little bit more about the Building Resilience program, and I look forward to your questions throughout the session. So I'll pass things across to you, Dane.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today, and looking forward to talking about one of my favorite topics, which is the topic of building resilience. And so I'm going to try to do 2 things in the relatively short time that we have together over the next 55 minutes or so. And the first is I actually want to step back and broaden our perspective around what resilience is. What do we actually mean when we say resilience? Because it's a very interesting concept that has been looked at through a number of different lenses over the past few years. And then I'm going to give a 10,000-foot view of what is a toolkit that we can all cultivate when it comes to enhancing our own personal resilience. And so we'll take a look at 4 crucial skills that we believe are pretty important when it comes to this great skill set of resilience. And so in service of the first of those 2 objectives, let's step back and take a look at what do we mean when we say a resilience. And I'm going to introduce a definition that's in 3 parts. Each one of the parts is going to draw on a slightly different field that has been looking into the area of resilience. And I'm going to start in a bit of a potentially unexpected place, and that place is New Orleans, and in particular, New Orleans just after Hurricane Katrina, which you can see in this photo here. Now, when Hurricane Katrina breached the levees, the houses that were built closest to the Gulf were hit immediately with a 25-foot wall of water, which actually ripped the houses off of their foundation. The houses that were built a little farther inland didn't experience the same blunt force trauma. What they got was water that slowly rose and rose and rose and forced people out of their ground floors into their second stories and eventually up onto their roofs. When the waters receded, and they hung around for, in some places, 2 to 3 weeks, but when they receded, it set up a very interesting experiment that has been studied by urban geographers and sociologists over the past 10 years, which was what is it that determines who is able to bounce back quicker after the water recedes. Now, when you first think about this challenge, you might think, well, it's going to be about building codes, right? The areas that were built more strongly are going to recover faster. And of course, building codes do have a mitigating effect. If it was a tear down to start with, it's not going to help. However, what you find is that once a structure has been underwater for 2 to 3 weeks, it doesn't really matter how well built it was. It's a tear down anyway. And so as scientists have started to look into this, to understand what it is that led some communities to thrive relatively quickly and other communities to take much longer to bounce back, what they have started to talk about is instead this concept of city resilience. And city resilience is the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and here's the critical part, grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. And what researchers have found is this is much more about how good are they at communicating with each other, how effective are communities at learning from things that don't work in the course of recovery and changing tack versus continuing to try the same thing over and over again. How much redundant capacity was there in the system in the first place? So this is our first part of our definition of resilience, the ability to grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks that we experience. For the second part of our definition, we're going to go to a very different place. And this photo is taken at Toronto Rehab. And I've been doing a fair bit of work with the executive team at Toronto Rehab over the past year on their strategy. And I can tell you, until I started working with the executive team, I had no idea that we were lucky enough to have this incredible institution in our country. It really is regarded as the world's leading institution for rehabilitation research. And what you see in this photo here is a treatment in their balance, mobility, and falls clinic, which is one of their big areas of research. Because, of course, if you've gone through a stroke or an acquired brain injury or you've fallen and broken a hip, learning to regain your balance and to prevent future falls is an absolutely critical part of rehabilitation. Now, historically, treatment for regaining balance and mobility has focused on teaching people to adopt really strong postures. So how do you stand in such a way that it's unlikely that you will fall over? What you see depicted in this photo here is a radical reinvention in the treatment in this area that's occurred over the past few years. You can see that the lady pictured here is actually secured to the ceiling through a harness, so she can't fall over. But what they do at this point is once they've secured her to the ceiling, they literally push her. They push her over, because what they have found through their research is it's not about how strong you stand in the first place. It's about how do you respond and recover at the moment of unsteadiness. What actually benefits people more is learning what it feels like to be off balance and regaining or relearning the skill set to recover from that position and regain your balance. And so that's the second part of our definition of resilience, which is about how do you respond and recover at the moment of unsteadiness. The final part of our definition for resilience comes from the world of elite sport, which is, of course, a world that is near and dear to us here at Performance Coaching. As Neil mentioned, we do a lot of work with elite sport in Canada, and in particular, I do a fair bit of work with parasport, with the Canadian Paralympic Committee. Many of you have likely heard of a program in Canada called Own the Podium. And Own the Podium was created when we won the bid for the 2010 Games in Vancouver. Prior to the Vancouver Games, we had what can only be described as a bit of a dismal record on home soil. We were the only country who had never won a gold medal at the Olympic Games competing on home soil, neither in Montreal nor in Calgary. And Own the Podium was created to ensure that did not happen again in Vancouver. One of the statistics that Own the Podium started to dig into pretty quickly after its formation was what they call the conversion rate. And what the conversion rate is they take all of the people who finished top 5 in a world championships the year prior to the Olympics, they call those the medal hopefuls, and they say what percentage of these folks actually ended up medaling the next year in the Olympic Games. When they originally carried out the research for Canada, our conversion rate was at 26%. Now, just for comparison's sake, the Germans were converting at a rate in the mid-90s, and the United States converted at 104% in 2002 in Salt Lake City, 104%. Now, if you can get your performance out in the World Championships, that means that you have the physical capabilities, you have the skill necessary to perform. The challenge can only lie in one place, which is about ultimately, do you have the internal skills, not just to perform at high levels, but to do it when the pressure is highest? Are you able to convert your ability, your skills, into performance when the pressure is on, like it is in an Olympic Games? And so those are really the three parts of our working definition of resilience, which is it's about how do you grow in the face of pressure and or acute shocks? How do you respond and recover when you hit those moments of unsteadiness and setbacks? And finally, how do you perform when the pressure is highest. Now, you may look at these three examples and say, okay, well, this is all, well and good and interesting, but, I'm not in New Orleans. I don't play for an Olympic team. I'm not recovering from a stroke. The thing is that we are all united with these three situations through one thing, and that thing is pressure. Because whether you are an Olympic or a Paralympic athlete, or you are somebody who is working in a corporate job, pressure is not just inevitable, not just something that kind of is going to happen no matter what. It's actually essential. It's required in all environments where high performance is expected. You cannot get to high performance without experiencing some kind of pressure. Pressure is inherent in, our ability or our journey, our human journey of growth. We all are going to experience pressure. And so when we experience pressure and when our resilience sets are called on, we really have four choices. The first choice, and the one we want to exercise whenever we have it, is to eliminate the stressor or modify the environment. I mean, why would we bother going to all the trouble to learn new skills, to change the way that we act, to change the way that we think, if we can eliminate the stressor? However, as we all know, this is sometimes not possible, right? There are lots of times when we can't eliminate the stressors in our life. And so the second choice that we have is to build and maintain our physical resilience, to make sure that the way in which we sleep, the way in which we eat, the way in which we undertake physical activity supports our ability to be resilient, to perform when we are under pressure, to recover from setbacks, to grow through pressure. The third choice that we have is to build and maintain our relationships. And there is a huge body of research, as there is, frankly, with the link between physical resilience and mental resilience, that links the quality of our social relationships to our own ability to sustain through pressure. One of the most famous of these is the Grant study, which has followed a cohort of Harvard graduates from the 30s all the way through their lives, conducting a series of psychological and medical tests on them on an annual basis. There's a ton of richness in this study. It just keeps producing and producing. Many of the second cohort of subjects are now in their 90s. But what George Valiant, the caretaker of the study, has said is the one thing that the study has taught him most is that in the end, the only thing that matters is relationships, the quality of our relationships with other human beings. It can act as a massive buffer when it comes to our ability to be resilient. The fourth choice that we have, and the one that we are going to focus on over the next 45 minutes, is the choice that we make for ourselves internally, which is to build the inner skills that enhance performance under pressure and increase our own resilience. And you can see a list of the skills that we're going to talk about underneath that choice. Where do these skills come from? When we're talking about the skills of resilience, where do we look in order to learn a little bit about the toolkit that we can use? Well, we turn to the discipline of sports psychology. And before we get into this, it's important to understand a little bit about the difference between traditional psychology and sports psychology. And so traditional psychology, as epitomized by Sigmund Freud, who you can see here, has largely focused on dysfunction, i.e., what does it take to get somebody from dysfunction back to normal functioning? And they have a whole classification of, different varieties of dysfunction and how do we move people back to normal functioning. The discipline of sports psychology really went to the complete other side of the continuum and said, what do exceptional performers like Ingmar Stenmark, the Olympic skier who's pictured here, what do they do internally in order to be able to perform so exceptionally under pressure externally? And the discipline of sports psychology, which has really evolved over the past 40 to 50 years from something that was much more art into something that is now much more scientific, informs the skill set that we're going to look at today. So what is that skill set? Well, the model you see in front of you is a visual depiction of how we think about the concept of personal resilience. And I want to start in the center, because in the center of the model is the self. And the self, you will see, is surrounded by body, feelings, and mind, which are the ways in which we interact with the world. The core of the personal resilience toolkit is in awareness. It is in our own ability to step back and become self-aware of what is going on in those three quadrants, mind, body, and feelings. This is a uniquely human capacity, right? We are uniquely blessed with the gift of what scientists call metacognition, the ability to step back and think about how we are thinking and think about how we are feeling and what's going on at the body level. right? We can step back and say, hey, I'm feeling angry right now. I'm feeling nervous right now. We can step back and say, hey, my mind's racing, or I'm really thinking self-defeating thoughts right now. We can step back and notice my shoulders are tense. All my muscles are seized up. I'm breathing high in my chest. Animals are not gifted with this ability, right? The snake does not see a threat, and they cannot step back and say, hey, I'm feeling threatened right now, right? I'm getting a little bit angry. Should I strike or not? They don't have that. They react. We are at our most human, frankly, when we are able to step back and observe what is going on and then make a choice. And we want to make a choice that supports our resilience. And so once we have stepped back, once we are at that point of awareness where we can choose, we have 4 different choices that we can make to either support or undermine our resilience. And the first is in the area of perspective. This is about how we choose to view the situation that we are in. Do we choose to see the threats, or do we choose to see the opportunities? As we will look at a little bit down the road, we always have this choice. This is always an option that is open to us. We can always frame the situation in a way that supports our confidence and supports our resilience, or we can choose to frame it in a way that makes us feel threatened, that undermines our confidence, that prolongs our feeling of stress and pressure. The second choice that we have is around energy. And energy management is about ultimately how much energy am I bringing into the situation that I find myself in. Because there's a balance between what we would call rust out, which is like, you're so flat that you don't have enough energy to do anything, and burnout, which is I'm constantly revving my engine so high that I'm at an energy level that is bad for performance and also bad for my health. And there are conscious skills that we can use to ensure we bring the right level of energy into any situation. The third set of skills that we're going to look at are the skills of imagination. And this is all about your mental game film. What are you running through your head? Are you running images, again, that are going to support your confidence and therefore your performance and resilience? Or are you running images that remind you of how you just screwed up that sales call, how you just had that really awkward interaction with a colleague? All of these things can either prolong the impact of stress and pressure, or they can support your ability to recover and remain resilient. And then the final thing is at the top, which is, of course, focus. What do we choose to focus on? And you will see that this is linked to what we call the North Star. This is the why, right? Ultimately, where am I headed and why am I headed there? What is it that gives the path that I'm on some kind of meaning? And so we're going to touch briefly on that at the end of the presentation today. So let's jump right into the first area, which is perspective. At a really fundamental level, the way that you view a situation determines how you respond, which makes this a pretty important element for resilience. When you are sitting in that meeting and you get asked a challenging question, do you choose to see it as a threat to your credibility, or do you see it as an opportunity to demonstrate your expertise? Depending on how you frame it, you are going to respond in 2 very different ways. The beautiful thing about perspective is that this is a choice that is always within our control. And if you ever doubt that, if you're ever in a situation where you say there is no possible way that I could choose to look at this differently, I suggest you take a minute and go back to high school and reread Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And for those of you who have read this book, it's one of those seminal books that I think everyone reads at some point in their education. Frankl's final conclusion after surviving the concentration camps in World War II was that the Nazis could take everything. They could take clothes, they could take water, they could take food. But the one thing they could not strip away was an innate human ability to choose to find meaning in what you were going through. And Frankl observed that the people who fared better in the concentration camps were those who were able to take a perspective that saw meaning in the situation they were going through, even if that meaning was just, I'm going to survive this so that I can tell everybody what happened here. We always have the ability to choose our perspective. Another really smart person, Albert Einstein, came at this topic from a slightly different direction. He said, if you really want to know the most that you possibly can about another human being, but you only have the opportunity to ask one question, make it this one. Is the universe a friendly place? Take a second and just think about your answer to that question. Is the universe a friendly place? What Einstein recognized was that knowing the answer to this question gives you a fundamental insight into how people view the world and therefore how they are likely to respond. Are they likely to be open to new challenges and therefore seek out to support, or are they going to anticipate harm and therefore withdraw. You need to know this about yourself because, frankly, this is really tied to our ability to be resilient. And it's tied in 3 different ways. And I'm just going to illustrate each of these points with some of the research that exists to tie these things together, because there's a ton of work being done in all of these areas. The first is the relationship between perspective and confidence. Now, of course, once you have the knowledge and skill in a particular area, the thing that most determines your level of performance is your confidence. Do you have the confidence to get your knowledge and skill out there in the different arenas in which you need to perform? Perspective plays a critical role in determining our level of confidence. And the area of research that has demonstrated this most conclusively is called priming. And if you want a great summary of all of the research that has been done on priming, I can't recommend a book any higher than Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel laureate. Priming is essentially the notion that when we reinforce stereotypes before people complete tasks, that can either enhance or detract their performance. Dr. Margaret Shih, who's out of UCLA Anderson, has done a study where she has Asian women write a math test, and she divides them into 2 groups and reminds each group of a different stereotype. One group, she'll say, you know, as Asians, you are going to do very well in this math test, right? Asians are typically very good at math, so she'll choose that stereotype. The other group, she'll say, well, you know, as women, we know that women typically aren't as good at math. Again, reinforcing a negative stereotype. And what she has proven conclusively is that the priming that exists, the stereotype that people carry in their head when they go in to carry out the exercise, significantly impacts the outcome. Did they suddenly become better or worse at math? No, absolutely not. But they went in with different confidence levels, which impacts performance. The second way that perspective impacts resilience is it literally directly impacts the health and well-being outcomes that happen under stress and pressure. There's a lot of evidence mounting that actually it's not the level of stress and pressure that you find yourself under that leads to the health and well-being outcomes. It's actually the perspective that you take to the stress that determines the physical outcomes. One study that is one of the kind of hallmarks in this area was carried out by Salovey, Crum, and Acor. Salovey is the current president of Yale, and Crum is a professor at Stanford. And what they did is they took 380 managers in the investment bank at UBS. These are people that are working 90, 100 hours a week. They are under incredible pressure. And they divided them into 2 groups. One group was shown a 3-minute video on stress that highlighted all the negative aspects of stress. Things like, you know, 1 million workers are absent on an average workday due to stress-related complaints. The other group was shown a 3-minute video that highlighted the positive impacts of stress. So stuff like, you know, the hormones released during the stress response boost performance in cognitive tasks. Both videos true, by the way, just selectively choosing to reinforce negative or positive perceptions about stress. They then followed up with the group of 380 managers 1 week later. They put them through 4 different assessment tools that had been validated statistically to produce reliable metrics on the health effects of stress and performance. So those were the 2 dimensions they were measuring. What they found was in the first group, the group that had seen the negative messages around stress, there was no change in either health or performance, which suggests that people tend to carry around a dominantly negative view of stress. The group, on the other hand, that saw the positive messages about stress 1 week later reported a 23% drop in physical symptoms, things like headaches, backaches, and fatigue, and they reported a 30% increase in productivity, purely from being given a different perspective, a different frame to put around the stress and pressure that they were experiencing. If you want to spend 9 minutes really well, or maybe it's actually 11 minutes, there's a great TED Talk called How to Make Stress Your Friend by Kelly McGonigal that overviews a different study that shows the link between the perspective we take to stress and the health and well-being outcomes that come as a result. The final link between perspective and resilience is around our ability to bounce back from setbacks. And the key piece of research in this area was carried out by Dr. Martin Seligman, who's often considered the father of performance psychology or positive psychology. And what he was able to show, he did a really interesting piece of research at an insurance company, MetLife, where insurance agents have to deal with setbacks and rejection day after day after day, was that people who take an optimistic mindset view setbacks as something that are out of their control and are not part of a pattern. So if I'm an insurance agent and I get rejected, if I'm an optimist, I go, yeah, you know, something was going on in that guy's day. He was in a bad mood, and I'll do better next time. Pessimists, on the other hand, tend to see setbacks as personal and as part of a pattern, right? I really screwed up that sales call, and this kind of thing always happens to me. And as a result, people that take an optimistic appraisal of events move more quickly to action and recover faster from setbacks. And so all of these things taken together show us that perspective, our ability to frame situations in an optimistic way, can dramatically impact our resilience, can be a huge ally when it comes to resilience. And William James, the father of American psychology, if Sigmund Freud is the father of psychology in general, William James is considered the father of American psychology, has said that the greatest discovery of my generation is that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, i.e. the way that we look at things internally, can change the outer aspects of their lives. And the skill set here is reframing. And reframing is the belief that if life chooses the information, we are free to choose the frame that we put around that information. And it usually takes one of three forms. The first is, it could have been worse. Now, this is not about artificially inventing, you know, terrible scenarios that could have happened to make yourself feel better. But from my own personal experience, you know, when my son was running himself in circles, dizzy around on our carpet, and then all of a sudden tripped and smashed his head off the corner of a coffee table, the number one thing that was running through my head as I rushed him to the hospital to get stitches in his forehead was, thank goodness that table didn't hit him an inch lower in the eye. Right? We can always see situations that put things in perspective for us. The second way to reframe is to think about, what are the lessons that we can learn here? This is one that often comes to me when I'm standing kind of tense in line at the grocery store and somebody at the front of the line is taking this as an opportunity to clean out the various change purses that they have and the little slot in their car where they keep their nickels. Right? I can choose to use this as an opportunity to flood my body with adrenaline and cortisol by getting really angry, or I can choose to use it as an opportunity to learn patience, which is something that I know I need to work on. Again, I can choose to frame it one way or another. And the final way is to look at, what are some new opportunities that might be created as a result of this? What are some things that are open to me now that weren't open before I was in this situation? That's perspective, and perspective can be very powerful. The second skill set we're going to talk about is the skill set of energy management. Now, if any of you joined Dr. Peter Jensen's webinar, Lessons in Resilience, you will have heard a much deeper look at this topic of energy management, and I would encourage you to all look up that webinar if you have a minute coming off of this one. So I'm going to give you a slightly higher level tour of the waterfront when it comes to energy management. The important thing when with respect to energy management is the relationship to time management, because very often time is the source of the pressure in our lives, right? Time is what has us making trade-offs that we don't want to make between the things that we have to do and the things that we know we should do. It's the reason that we have to stay up late at night to get our work done. And so we often turn, as a result of the pressure coming from time, to time management as a way to resolve this pressure. The challenge with this, however, is that, of course, time is a finite quantity, right? The number of hours in a day has not changed in a very long time. Energy, on the other hand, determines how much we can accomplish in a given amount of time. The challenge is that unless we manage our energy, unless we consciously work at managing it, we are at the mercy of our biology. And leaving our energy levels at the mercy of biology is neither good for health, nor is it good for performance. So let's just take a look at why that's the case. When it comes to the health side, Dr. Herbert Benson, who is a researcher out of the Harvard Medical School, wrote a great book. It was actually decades ago now. It was in the 70s, but it's just as relevant today as it was when it first came out. It was called The Relaxation Response. And what Dr. Benson articulated in that book was that the fight or flight response, which was originally baked into us through evolution to help us survive, right, to deal with situations when we were confronted with threats to our survival, and it would flood our bodies with adrenaline and cortisol, which would heighten our senses, which would quicken our responses, which would send blood to our quadriceps and muscles that we needed to be able to react quickly, was not as finely tuned an instrument as we would like it to be. And so in an average modern day or week or month, The fight or flight response is getting tripped all the time by things it was not designed for. Things like a call that comes at 4:30 in the afternoon saying that your kid is sick and needs to get picked up early from daycare. Things like an email from your boss at 10:50 at night when you're just trying to go to sleep saying that you need to redo some work that you've done, or a client calling you late in the day, dumping more work on your plate, or that late Friday afternoon call when you're getting ready to head up north for the weekend. These things trip our fight or flight response in ways that it was never designed to be used, and for many of us mean that we are walking around constantly with elevated levels of energy and therefore elevated levels of adrenaline and cortisol coursing through our bodies, which is not good for health. And Dr. Benson showed a direct link between the repeated elevation of the fight or flight response and blood pressure, hardening of the arteries, and eventually heart attacks and heart disease. So, not managing our energy has very significant health impact. On the performance side, what we know is that there is a direct link between how pumped up I am, how much energy I bring into a situation, and how much I can pay attention to. When I get really pumped up, my attentional focus narrows. It's hardwired into us. I can't pay attention to as much information. Many of us know this intuitively, right? When we're facing off against somebody who is angry or really upset or nervous or anxious, we kind of say to ourselves, you know what, I need to give this person a minute. They're literally not going to be able to hear what I'm trying to communicate to them. And I think a lot of us have probably experienced this personally as well. If you go into a meeting and you're sitting there and you're starting off your presentation, you're feeling pretty good, all of a sudden you get hijacked and somebody asks a really hostile question from the side of the table. What happens? Well, your energy level spikes, and all of a sudden you're kind of fumbling around, you're trying to figure out how to respond, you're trying to marshal your facts. What happens when you leave the meeting? 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later you get flooded with all of the, oh my gosh, when they said this, why didn't I say that? Why didn't I talk about this particular thing? Why didn't I bring this data point to the table? If we can access it 5 minutes later, why couldn't we access it in the moment? Well, quite simply because our energy level gets too pumped up, we get too pumped up, and we miss relevant information. We can't access all of the information we need at the moment, and in sport, we call this choking. What all of this means is, to use a metaphor, we want to start to think of ourselves and manage ourselves more like a thermostat than a thermometer. Because, of course, a thermometer simply rises and falls with the temperature in the environment. A thermostat, on the other hand, sets the temperature. So many of us at home will set the temperature to one place during the day, and then maybe we turn the thermostat down a little bit at night because we sleep better and we want to save some money on energy. That rhythm, that up and down rhythm, by the way, is pretty analogous to how we want to manage our own energy levels. We have a partnership with the Canadian Sport Institute Ontario, which is a training ground for Olympic and Paralympic athletes here in Ontario. And the director of sports science and sport medicine at CSIO is a guy by the name of Troy Taylor. And one of the things that Troy does is that he tracks the workload of athletes, whether they're training at the facility or outside of the facility. Every 3 months or so, he'll go over the training logs of an athlete with them to look for patterns and to give them some feedback. And I asked Troy a number of months ago, I said, Troy, what are you looking for when you were looking over 3 months of data from an athlete? And he said, well, the number one thing I'm looking for is I'm looking for variation. I'm looking for periods of, peak intensity where they're working out at a really high level, and then I'm looking for valleys of recovery, peaks of intensity, valleys of recovery. He said, because if I see an athlete who's been operating at peak intensity repeatedly for the last 3 months, I know they are not going to perform as well as they want to come competition time. To use the example of the thermostat, if you keep your thermostat cranked up for the entire month, you are going to get a significant bill at the end of that month. The same is true for us, except the bills that we get, you can't pay with money, right? You pay with performance and you pay with health outcomes. So one of the critical skills when it comes to resilience is cultivating this ability to turn our inner thermostat down, to modulate our energy level when we realize we're too pumped up or we've been carrying too much energy for too long. And just like we talked about at the very beginning, that we can step back and notice our mind, our body, and our feelings, these are the 3 different ways that we can go in and turn the thermostat down. We might choose to go in at the mind level. We talked about the skill of reframing already. If we frame a situation more positively, often that helps to bring our energy level down a little bit. We may also go in at the feelings level. use a technique called retracing, which is about looking at negative emotions, things like anxiousness or nervousness, and saying, okay, where did this come from? Let me go back through my day. Was I nervous when I came in this morning? Was I anxious at lunch? Okay, something must have happened in between. Ah, right. It was that meeting that I had with Paul, right? Paul said that thing and it just set me off. At that point, we know what we need to let go of. And that's where imagery can become an assist, and we'll talk about this in a second, because often once we've identified where the emotion came from that's got us all pumped up and anxious and nervous, we can use imagery to let it go, to change the game film that we're running in our head. The final way we can turn down the thermostat is at the body level, and this is often the most direct hit, because many of us carry tension, we carry pressure and stress at the physical level. Right? We start to breathe higher in our chest, our shoulders get tense, they get hunched up. For me, it's my jaw will start to clench. And so when we go in at the body level, we can score a direct hit. And particularly effective in this area is breathing. Biathlon is a particularly challenging sport. It combines cross-country skiing with target shooting. And the reason that this is so challenging is that cross-country skiing is an activity that requires a huge amount of cardiovascular endurance, right? Tons of oxygen, massive blood flow feeding these huge muscle groups, quadriceps and hamstrings and glutes that are required to cross-country ski. And so you start breathing very heavily, your heart rate is pounding, and then you have to transition into an activity that is all about precision, target shooting, right? You're hitting a target the size of a quarter from tens of yards away. What's really bad for a precision activity like target shooting? Heaving breath, right? Pounding heart rate, all of these things that are going to cause you to lose a little bit of your accuracy. Now, in the old days, a couple decades ago, you could still do really well in international competition by leaving a little bit of time between the ski and the shoot, right? You get out of your skis, you'd let your heart rate come down a little bit, you'd lie down and you would shoot. Today, in order to do well in international competition, you do not have that luxury. You have to go immediately from the skiing, get down on the ground, and start shooting. And so every single biathlete that is successful in international competition today has a breathing technique. They have the ability to rapidly bring their energy level down through breathing. There are athletes out there who, within the span of 2 or 3 breaths, can lower their heart rate by 50 beats per minute. Many of them use a technique called centering, and they do not use this because it's the second or the third most effective way to bring their energy levels down. They use it because it's often the best way to bring their energy level down. Now, if you want to learn more about this, it helps to have a master to turn to, and we're lucky enough that we have them all around us. They are babies. Babies know how to breathe, right? They know the right way to breathe. And if you watch a baby breathe, what do you see? You see the stomach rise and fall, because we are designed to breathe out of our diaphragms. It's what keeps oxygen and carbon dioxide in balance in our bodies. Breathing is great at bringing the energy level down for a couple of reasons, but one of them brings us back to Dr. Herbert Benson and the relaxation response. Because what Dr. Benson discovered was that right beside the fight or flight response in our brain, we have this other response called the relaxation response. And it has the opposite effect to the fight or flight response. When we tap into the relaxation response, it actually relaxes us, as the name implies, right? It brings our energy level down. One of the great ways, or the easiest ways to tap into this response is through our breathing, through moving our breathing down into our diaphragm, through making the exhalations longer than the inhalations, and working on relaxing our muscles as we breathe out. Now, a webinar is a very difficult place to teach breathing and to teach the centering technique in particular. However, you can find instructions for centering on the QSB Insight website. If you search thermostat, there is an article by Dr. Peter Jensen from our firm that includes a link to centering instructions. And perhaps we can post those instructions as well alongside the recording of this webinar when it goes up. And so managing our energy combined with perspective are the first 2 skills that can help us when it comes to improving our resilience. The third skill set is about imagination, and really it's about imagery, the imagery that we run through our heads. Images, the images that we hold in our heads are unbelievably powerful. Einstein went so far as to say that imagination is more powerful than knowledge, which is a pretty interesting thing to say as a guy who spent his entire life pursuing knowledge. But When you dig deeper into that quote, what you find is that, science is one kind of knowledge. It's the knowledge about the world as it is and why it got that way and how it came to be. Imagination is really a different kind of knowledge. It's knowledge about the future, about what's possible. We would not have a democracy today if somebody in Athens 2,500 years ago had not imagined what a democracy could look like. We would not have landed a probe on a comet if some scientist somewhere had not imagined that that was possible. At a more personal level, quite literally, you cannot get up and walk out of this room without first imagining what is going to happen. Now, most of us do that subconsciously by this point. However, it is images in our brain that direct the timing and sequence of our movements. Our body doesn't speak English or French, it speaks image. That's the way that we communicate. Our brains communicate with our muscles and with our nervous system. If you want to understand the power of imagination from another angle, all you have to do is look at who are the people that try to stamp out imagination. When fascists come to power, when dictators come to power, who do they go after first? They go after the poets, they go after the authors, they go after anybody who can help people imagine a better future than the situation that they are currently in right now. They understand the power that our imaginations have to drive action. Now, why do I start at this really grandiose level of Einstein and fascism and asteroids and democracy? It really is just a way to hammer home how important imagination is when it comes to driving our actions. Imagery, the images we run in our head, really are a holistic language for human performance. And it's so powerful because it's one of the only things that goes in simultaneously through all three of these channels that we have discussed: mind, feelings, and body. Well, let's start at the body level. When it comes to your body does not distinguish between real and imagined experiences. If I imagine myself throwing a baseball, as long as I have at some point in my life thrown a baseball so my body knows what it feels like, my brain will fire the same neuromuscular pathways as it fires when I actually throw a ball. Mental rehearsal has been shown to be incredibly powerful for driving performance gains in athletes who already know the physical side of the game. You know this as well from, trying to fall asleep at night, right? When you are caught between being awake and being asleep and you start dreaming a little bit and you dream that you maybe miss a step and you fall, what happens? You jerk, right? Your whole body jerks. It starts to wake up because your body does not differentiate between real and imagined experiences. What does this mean? What this means is that if you have a bad sales call or a bad meeting or a bad conversation with a colleague in the morning, and you are still replaying that thing over and over on the drive home, right? You're hitting the steering wheel going, man, why on earth did I say that? Your body is not just experiencing that failure once, it is experiencing it 7, 8, 9 times on the drive home. You are getting all the impacts on performance, on confidence, and frankly on your physiology as if you had gone through that experience 8 or 9 times. There's a really good reason why people say great athletes have short memories, because they are able to consciously go inside and say, okay, I've got that failure played through once. Now I'm going to change the film and I'm going to focus on what I want. I'm going to replay the game film acting the way that I want to act. When it comes to feelings, the images that we run in our head drive the emotions that we feel. Emotions don't come from nowhere, right? They come from our imagery. Here's an example that I think many people will be able to relate to. Let's say you're sitting alone in your house at night and you hear a noise from the basement, a loud noise, like an unambiguous noise. The first thing you start to do is you start to mentally run through a picture of, what are all the things in my basement that could have possibly made that noise? But you can't match it. So you start to get up and you walk and you hear the noise again. And you start to think, okay, there's somebody in my basement. And you start imagining this person downstairs. You get to the top of the stairs and you're looking down the stairs and you're thinking about going down. And at that point in time, you are starting to imagine every movie that you have ever seen where somebody hears a noise in the basement and they stand at the top of the stairs and they start to go down there. Now, there is nobody in the basement, but it doesn't matter, right? You already have all of the emotions as if somebody is down there. You have the nervousness, you have the fear, you have the anxiety, you probably have the goosebumps or the hair standing up on your arms. The images that you get are what drive the emotions. And then finally, the mind? Well, the important thing here is that imagery is the bridge between the things we think and action, what we do. There's a great book by John Cotter, who is probably the preeminent thinker on change management of the 20th century, called The Heart of Change. And what Cotter conclusively demonstrates in this book is that even though we think we are unbelievably rational, like we are presented with information, we analyze it, and then we choose what to do based on that information, that in reality, what we choose to do is driven by what we imagine. We see something, we get an image of something, it causes us to feel something, and that's what drives our actions. It's not, think, analyze, do. It's see, feel, do. And so for the mind, imagery is a powerful way to link our thoughts to action. Now, when you take all of this together, what are the implications? Well, imagery is crucial, is the dominant implication, but there are three kind of subpoints to that. The first is, as we've talked about, images are events to the body. Don't overpay for your mistakes. The images you run can either undermine your resilience, they can prolong feelings of self-doubt, of self-criticism, of lack of confidence, or they can enhance our feelings of confidence. Our sense of mastery can be greatly enhanced by imagery. If we are able to change the mental game film to support what we want, to move away from replaying the failures that we've had and start playing the successes that we want to see in the future, we can dramatically enhance our sense of mastery. And frankly, what you see is what you are going to get. We cannot do things we can't imagine. What you see is what you get. What you run through your head is the stuff that is going. Now, I'm not talking here about stuff like, The Secret, that book where they say, you just imagine it and you'll manifest it, you'll walk into it. That's not what this is about. That stuff is, for lack of a better word, a garbage to some extent. What we're talking about here is the link between what you imagine and how you act, how you perform. There is a direct link between the thoughts that you run through your head and the images that they produce and the way in which you act, the way in which you respond. So we want to be consciously choosing the imagery that's running through our heads. Now, we've talked about perspective, we've talked about energy, we've talked about imagination. Right at the top of the compass here, at the north point of the compass, we have another important skill set, which is all about focus. And focus is about bringing the future into clear focus, as the word says. This is about how we articulated a vision for ourselves that is clear and compelling. We all carry around a picture of the future, whether it's conscious or unconscious. We all have something that we expect to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. And in fact, hundreds of people every day get exactly what they expect, but not what they want. And so from a resilience standpoint, it is very important to look up every once in a while and make sure that we are heading in the right direction. And that's what we call the North Star. Now, again, we don't want to be too idealistic or fluffy about this stuff, right? This is not about walking around in a constant state of nirvana. We have to take care of achievement. We have to take care of survival, right? We need to make money. We need to put roofs over our heads. We need to feed our kids and our families. This is about every once in a while, am I looking up and making sure that I'm ending up somewhere that has meaning for me? Because meaning comes in moments. It's not a constant state. And I'll give you an example of this from my own personal life. I have 2 kids. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And anybody who knows me would say that, raising my kids is a massive source of meaning to me. It is a huge part of my North Star. Watching them grow and develop and playing a role in their development is something that I find tremendously meaningful. However, 80 to 90% of the time, my kids are a real pain, right? It's trying to get them to go to bed. It's trying to get them to brush their teeth. It's trying to get them to stop crying. It's changing out of the snowsuit for the 3rd time because they have to go to the bathroom. And yet, there are those moments, right? There are those moments where, like I just watched my 3-year-old put together a new puzzle for the first time, watching him figure out where those pieces go, and you get this unbelievable sense of satisfaction. Getting caught out in a snowstorm on a grocery run in January and just careening wildly down the street with the stroller, laughing as, snowflakes fall and hit us in the face. There are these moments where what we are doing intersects with meaning, and we say, you know what, this is ultimately what it's all about. And what's important for resilience, for our ability to recover at moments of unsteadiness, to maintain performance under pressure, is to look for ways to increase the frequency of those moments. how are we shaping the way in which we work? How are we shaping our lives, our relationships, our physical resilience so that those moments occur a little bit more frequently? Again, this is not about walking around in a constant state of nirvana. It is about how do we make sure that we live a little bit closer to those moments that infuse our lives with meaning and therefore help us through moments of unsteadiness. So taken together, these are a few ways in which we can enhance our own personal resilience. And I want to just, by way of a summary, to bring this all together, talk about the concept of attention. Attention drives performance. What we choose to pay attention to is ultimately what determines how we perform. And one of the threads that you'll notice that brings all of these things together is they're all about where you put your attention. Whether it's perspective, I can decide to put my attention on the positive things or the negative things. Whether it's energy, I can, choose to put my attention on something that is going to get me more excited and more anxious and more nervous, or I can pay attention to my breathing and bring my energy level down. Imagination, I can pay attention to replaying all the failures that I've had, or I can redirect my attention towards what I want. Focus, I can choose to pay attention to these things that either distract me from the good things in my life, or I can pay attention to the things that have meaning for me. As an individual, our ability to step back and to consciously direct my attention or our attention to the things that are going to support resilience as opposed to the things that are going to undermine it is ultimately the uniting concept that brings all of these things together. And so with that, I know we want to leave some time for Q&A, so I will pass it back over to you, Neil, and hopefully we have a few questions that we can tackle.
We certainly do have a few questions that have come in, and I encourage people who haven't yet typed their question to please send them in. We'll get them in the queue, and we'll try to play Stump the Expert here with Dane. This is the first question that came in quite early on, as you were talking about snakes, the difference between snakes and humans. Sometimes, despite being human, we forget to analyze ourselves before acting. How do you train someone to be self-aware on a more consistent basis?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And embedded in that question is a little bit of a catch-22, which is as we get more and more pumped up, it becomes harder to pay attention to more things. And yet, when we are the most pumped up is when we actually need to be able to step back and pay attention. And so the number one thing we want to do here is develop a little bit of a mnemonic or almost a hardwired response. Right, in athletes, we call this unconscious competence or muscle memory. If you think about paramedics, who are people that operate in really high-stakes situations all the time, they have their ABC, right, which is airway, breathing, circulation. And the idea behind that is they don't have to think when they get in a situation. They know, first I look at the airway, then I look at breathing, then I look at circulation. And the same can be true for us when it comes to self-awareness. And our ABCs kind of tend to consist of two parts. The first is knowing your triggers. So knowing what is likely to trigger high levels of energy and therefore get you really identified with your anger, your racing mind, or your emotion. So for me, my triggers are, when I get interrupted, when somebody's dismissive of my opinion, or when I get challenged on something that is really meaningful to me that I've spent a lot of time on. I know those in advance, and so I start to prepare before I go into situations where those are likely to occur. That's knowing your triggers. The second thing is you want to understand your signals. So what are the things that are going to tell you that you right now are a little too pumped up, that you're maybe not, acting the way that you want to act? And these can come at the mind level, at the body level, or at the feelings level. Mine at the body level is my jaw. My jaw starts to clench. But we heard a great story from a guy who was in one of our workshops years ago, and he was going to court he was being sued for patent infringement by one of these patent troll corporations that kind of troll around looking for people to sue. And he was very personally offended by the fact that this lawsuit was even proceeding. And so he would get really engaged, and he would try to fight back and answer all these questions that people were posing. And his lawyer finally said to him, okay, every time you feel your back leave the chair, like you're leaning forward, that is your signal that you need to step back, you need to take a couple breaths and calm down. And so that was his little device to let him know when he might need to step back, every time he felt his back leave the chair. And so to circle back on the question, to me it's understanding your triggers so you can prepare a little bit, and then having that signal that for me, when I feel this start to happen, that's when I need to get myself under control. That's a good way to get a head start on it.
All right. Next up, how can you help someone who has lost their North Star in your diagram? So how do you rediscover your passion after years of burnout?
Yeah, I mean, this is really a question about the meaning of life, which is a much longer topic that people have thought about for thousands of years. I don't think there's one answer to that question, but what I will say is that often the answers start to come from kind of repeatedly asking the question why. And I'll give you an example from the work that we do in sport. Athletes very often have what they think is a North Star, which is the gold medal, right? They see their North Star as standing on the podium and getting, the medal around their neck, the national anthem playing, the flags going up behind them. And yet, for many of them, when they get there, they don't feel the sense of achievement or satisfaction or meaning that they thought they would. And so one of the things that we do with athletes is we dig into why. Why do you want to win a gold medal? What does it represent to you? Because often underneath that stuff, you start to think about what are the more fundamental drivers for me of meaning. And often they're about one of two things. How are you bringing joy to other people? So a lot of athletes will say, well, you know what, actually the reason I really want to win this medal is because I want to thank my mom for driving me to the rink every morning, 5 days a week for 10 years at 6 a.m. Or I want to thank my brother who got dragged along with her for, for those 10 years. So often it's about, in what ways am I bringing joy to other people? And then the flip side of that is, what is it that creates joy for me? So again, for athletes, it may be, well, I want to do this because it's the purest expression of who I am. I am, an exceptional hockey player. I am an exceptional skater. So I don't have a really crisp answer for you other than to say, usually it's some combination of helping people reconnect with what they do that brings joy to them and how they would like to bring joy to others. And often that gets uncovered with kind of asking them, why? Why do you want to do what you want to do until you get down to one of those two things?
All right, and maybe similar to the meaning of life here, do you believe that optimism or lack thereof is something that's hardwired genetically into us, or can an individual learn to be more optimistic?
Yes. Yes, I believe both of those things. We could go back and forth all day on trait versus state. But there is, people lean one way or the other. That's the point of Einstein's question, is in general, people lean towards optimism or pessimism. And it's not like a binary thing. You're either an optimist or a pessimist. It exists on a continuum. But we all lean one direction or another. So yes, I absolutely believe there's an element of it that is some combination of genetics and, your early upbringing. However, research has shown pretty consistently that you can learn to be more optimistic. In fact, the name of one of Seligman's earliest books was Learned Optimism, and the opposite of which is learned helplessness. So through training, you can learn to round out your perspective. Now, that's not to say it will ever become unconscious to you, but it's a skill that you can cultivate, the skill of reframing, the skill of looking for opportunities, of consciously stepping back and saying, what might I be missing here? If I just look at the threats, what are some of the opportunities that get created? And frankly, the other is also true. I'm somebody who is a super optimist. And what that means is that I actually make errors in the other direction, right? I assume that things are going to go great, that traffic is never going to be a problem, that the TTC in Toronto is never going to break down, and therefore I am often late for meetings. And so you can also learn to stop yourself a little bit and say, okay, what are some of the threats that I might be missing here? What are some of the downsides? If this were to go wrong, how do I think it would go wrong? What would be the thing that would trip this up? So yes, to both parts of your question, my perspective is yes, it's hardwired, and you can move from that baseline through practice.
All right, a personal question for you based on your own experience. What is the best example that you've witnessed yourself of strong resilience in another human being?
This may be a bit of a cliche answer, but it really is. It really is. It was an unbelievable example for me. So we have, as an organization, we've worked with the women's Olympic hockey team for the past 14 years over the past 3 Olympic cycles. And in Sochi this year, for anybody that followed the women's Olympic team, they had ample opportunity to demonstrate resilience. And in particular in the gold medal game, down 2 goals with 3.5 minutes to go in the game, I certainly was sitting there mentally going through that thing you go through where you're preparing yourself for defeat, right? Like, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it. Silver medal's pretty good, right? And then at that moment, they score, right? And then they pull the goalie and they score again. They send it to overtime. They score in overtime, and they bring it home 3-2. And for me, the reason it's such an example of resilience is, you look at the men's game, which is great, but they built a huge lead and then they cruised to victory. That's not resilience to me. That's high performance. Resilience is all about when you are down 2 goals. You wish you weren't down 2 goals. When you are down 2 goals, how do you respond? And they responded in a way that I think made certainly the folks, us who work with them directly proud, but by extension, everybody who was watching pretty proud. So again, it's a little bit of a cliche example, but honestly, for me, it was such an encapsulation of what resilience looks like. It's being down by 2 goals and being able to pull it through and maintain your confidence and eventually recover and respond from that moment of unsteadiness.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions. I've got them here. So next one, what is the most important aspect of your model between perspective, imagination, and energy? Is there a way to prioritize one, or do they all need to be balanced?
That's a great question. I don't think there's any way for me to prioritize one without knowing a little bit more about the person who is asking the question. I think for each of us, they can take on different weights and different importance depending on our unique kind of challenges and strengths. I think perspective is very fundamental. And so, if you are somebody who tends to lean towards a very pessimistic appraisal of events, I think that perspective would be probably the dominant thing and one to really work on, just because taking that appraisal of events has such a dramatic impact on confidence and on health and well-being and on setbacks, as we talked about. So if you are somebody who leans more to pessimism, that would be a really good place to start. The interesting thing is that perspective and imagination are so darn interlinked. What you imagine, the images that you're running through your head plays such a huge role in determining how you are going to look at the situation that it's very hard to work on one without working on the other, quite frankly. So they tend to be areas where things are dramatically, if you take action, you will have action on both of those areas. Energy for me is, if you are in high pressure situations regularly where you need to perform at high levels under pressure, that would be the place to start. Because when your energy gets out of whack, it's pretty much the single biggest cause of performance errors. You're too pumped up, you miss information, you make errors, you end up choking, to use a word from sport. So I guess that would be my kind of roundabout answer, is it depends on the unique challenges you're dealing with. But if you are somebody who is afflicted by a very pessimistic mindset, I think perspective would be a great place to start. If it's more about how do I access performance on demand in high pressure situations, energy management would probably be a good place to start.
All right, so our final question today, before we move on to talk a little bit more about this Building Resilience program. You spoke a lot about personal strategy. You also mentioned working with an organization on their strategy. What roles do you feel that the organization or workplace can play in facilitating resilience of their employees?
Yeah, absolutely great question, because there is a role for the organization broadly. Then there is a role for the leaders, individual managers, and then there is the role that we've been talking about today, which is the role that we all kind of play in our own resilience. I think the most important thing that the organization as a whole can do is to regulate the environment so that people are not being asked to deal with, the whipsaw effect of changing strategies wildly back and forth, of saying one thing and doing another, essentially consistency. A combination of consistency to the point that it's possible, and we know that things change and we live in a dynamic environment, but many organizations can still provide some level of consistency, and then support for times when things are not going as well as we want them to, because of course relationships and having support resources are really important. When you come down one level from the broad organization and you say, well, what role do leaders or managers play? They play a huge role in their work groups. And in fact, we have a whole different area on that, which we call Ignite, that talks about, how they have to build trust. They have to be able to help people work through blocks. They have to be able to help people frame adversity in a way that is meaningful to them. And they have to manage themselves, frankly. They have to be able to show up in a way that helps other people move to high performance and resilience. So yeah, it's an onion for sure, and the organization definitely has a responsibility, because if the strategy is whipsawing back and forth and people are constantly being asked to change to new priorities and do more with less and restructure, that will overwhelm a lot of the efforts farther down the line. So it's definitely a shared responsibility.
Okay, so to wrap things up, I know I've had a number of people asking how can we learn more about this topic. We do have a program, a Building Resilience program, coming up in Toronto, and Dane, hopefully you can give us a little bit more insight into what happens during that day.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll say is we just moved this from June 16th to June 12th. So just if you are planning for this, it's on Friday, June the 12th now. And the workshop will feel very familiar to what you just went through. So I did kind of the 45-minute tour of the waterfront in the day of. We take the model that we looked at and we break it apart and we dive into each one of those 4 skill sets, and we learn practical skills that you can apply, and then we have a chance to practice them in the classroom. So it's a very interactive day, and it really does focus on practical skills across those 4 different areas that we looked at.
All right, thank you, Dane. As individuals, as you close out of the event today, you'll be greeted with a survey. If you're interested in learning more about this program or a number of other programs offered by Queen's School of Business, please feel free to indicate that on the survey, and a member of our team will be more than happy to follow up. We're going to be wrapping up today's webinar here. Thank you so much, Dane. We've had a massive number of people here, and everybody's had great feedback. And additionally, just remember this event will be, the recording of this will be posted to QSB Insight next week. And additionally, if you would like to be invited to future QSB Insight webinars, simply visit qsb.ca/webinars. We'll add you to our invitation list, and you'll be hearing more from us in the coming weeks. So thank you, Dane. Have a wonderful afternoon, and that's all from Queens.